Okay, I think it's stabilizing now. So I'm going to start again. So I'm going to welcome everyone again on behalf of the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales, BHRC. I'm Aswini Weeraratne, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to this panel on human rights and the rule of law in Sri Lanka. This is the second in our series on diminishing democracy, and we have an expert panel here to dissect and explain the shocking events in Sri Lanka unfolding over this past year. Before introducing our eminent speakers, and mindful that most of our audience will be well informed on the situation in Sri Lanka, but that others may not be, I'm going to try and highlight some of the key features of what's been happening, offering some context to try and provide a starting point for our discussions. I should say that the situation is complex, and if you want a detailed account, I would refer you to the most recent UN Human Rights Council report of 6 September and the resolution on 6 October, which are available on the HRC website, which unfortunately seems to have developed a glitch over the last day or so, which hopefully will be resolved soon. And also see the statements of BHRC jointly issued with the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute, available on our website. So BHRC is among a multitude of other international human rights organizations, including the UN, that has been expressing grave concerns about the serious deterioration of human rights in Sri Lanka now and in the past. The past concerns not only the need for accountability and reparations for violations committed during the period of war, but also the use of draconian legislation such as the Prevention of Terrorism Act to detain human rights activists and defenders without judicial or other due process of law. We will hear that there is an important context spanning back to events prior to 2022, so that some of what is happening now is not new. To the present, since at least March 2022, we know Sri Lanka has been overwhelmed by significant political and economic upheaval. An intense cost of living crisis and severe shortages of essential food goods, essentially including food, medicines, and fuel, have created a desperate situation leading to a popular uprising known as Aragalaya, calling for a wholesale change in the government. Sri Lankans from various socioeconomic, cultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds have gathered in a mass protest movement, demanding greater transparency, accountability for corruption and economic mismanagement, and increased participation in democratic life. Two key consequences of the current upheaval are that the Sri Lankan government is now presiding over increasing poverty and starvation in its population, and using some draconian measures to quell lawful dissent and protest against this situation. Some are now calling Sri Lanka a police state. The right to food, health, nutrition, and work is protected under the Sri Lankan constitution and international law. It's being threatened by food insecurity driven by high food prices, food inflation at 81%, and reduced income. A UN survey indicates that 4 out of 5 people have been skipping meals. Up to 70% of households have had to reduce food consumption, and 6.3 million people are food insecure. Add to that constitutional and institutional failures and corruption of the rule of law. The presidency under the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, introduced in 2020, has been described as an imperial presidency, which has proved a disaster for the economy and the rule of law in Sri Lanka. This amendment introduced a powerful executive presidency and eroded independence of key commissions and institutions, including the Human Rights Commission, the Election Commission, the National Police Commission, the Commission to investigate allegations of bribery or corruption, and the judiciary. And add into that gross economic mismanagement and corruption. A number of controversial economic policies were adopted by the former government, including a tax cut to stimulate the economy, an overnight ban on the import of chemical fertilizers, leading to crop production, and a lack of competent fiscal regulation. These exacerbated a pre-existing vulnerability to economic crisis through persistent fiscal mismanagement. Remarkably, the Supreme Court has recently accepted a petition filed on economic mismanagement and is calling for evidence from the government. And into that mix goes corruption with impunity. Between 2020 and 2022, a number of corruption and other related economic crimes cases were discontinued by the Attorney General or the Commission to investigate bribery and corruption. The mass protest is calling for wholesale governmental change, and what they've got so far appears to be a shuffling of the existing deck. The change achieved has placed Ranil Wickremesinghe, a T-Rex from a political dynasty, the sole representative of his party in parliament, first as Prime Minister and since 21st July as president. Former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, previously president between 2005 and 2015, resigned on 9th May after his supporters attacked peaceful protesters in the capital, Colombo, resulting in widespread violence, the deaths of people, and around 60 houses of parliamentarians were burned or damaged. Continuing countrywide protests culminated in a massive demonstration in Colombo on 9th July. Thousands of protesters stormed and occupied offices and the official residence of then-President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, brother of Mahinda. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country, resigned on 15th July to be replaced by Ranil Wickremesinghe. Gotabaya Rajapaksa has returned to Sri Lanka on the 2nd of September. So while President Wickremesinghe undoubtedly enjoys the support of the previous ruling party, still with the majority in Parliament, and the Rajapaksas, he has reportedly sought to establish an all-party government. He has appealed for the unity of Sri Lankans across all communities and made other gestures of appeasement toward the protest movement and promised constitutional and other reforms. However, at the same time, the UN reports that the government has sent mixed signals that appear to reflect a continuity with the past. The new administration has pursued a tougher approach to the ongoing protests. This tougher approach of President Wickremesinghe has been denounced by the UN Human Rights Office and others as permitting the arbitrary detention of protesters and the search of private property without due process, the criminalization and assaults on peaceful protesters, lawyers, journalists, the disappearance and detention of ordinary citizens, including students and young activists. Scores have been arrested and detained, often by unidentifiable men in unmarked cars. The government states many have been granted bail. Security forces used excessive force to clear the protest camp in Colombo and then to suppress peaceful student protest on 18th August. There are reports that just yesterday, the police attacked a peaceful protest organized by the Inter-University Students' Federation near the Kelaniya University. The use of water cannons and tear gas against protesters is reported. The police have used live ammunition during a spontaneous protest at a fuel distribution point, killing 1 and injuring 24 earlier in the year. So it's clear that Sri Lankan authorities continue to misapply human rights standards, including through the use of the controversial and discredited Prevention of Terrorism Act and other pieces of legislation, and now also the introduction of the repressive and ominous Bureau of Rehabilitation bill. Today, we have a full agenda to try and get through. We're going to be looking at the economic and political mismanagement of fundamental rights and the impact on fundamental rights, what place human rights has in mitigating an economic crisis, should human rights be at the heart of negotiation with the IMF, what are Sri Lanka's obligations under international law and how can they be enforced? How do we protect human rights defenders? What is the will and ability of Parliament to achieve meaningful constitutional change as demanded by the protest movement and others? What is the role of the Supreme Court in achieving redress for HR violations and holding the government to account? And of course, the role of the IMF and other international bodies in ensuring protection, promotion of fundamental rights, the rule of law, and honest government. Tackling these issues for us, I'm honoured to welcome Ambika Satkaranathan, Fellow of the Open Society Foundation and former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, amongst many other esteemed things. Dr. Deepaka Udagama, Professor, Human Rights Activist, and former Head of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, and again, amongst many other accomplished achievements. And Upul Jayasuriya, President's Counsel, former President of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, and former President of the Columbus Law Society, and again, amongst many other notable achievements. There will be time for an extended Q&A after the speaker's presentation, so please pop your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So with that opening, I'm going to turn to Ambika. Please, Ambika, it's over to you.
Thank you, Aswini, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. As you rightly said in your opening, There are historical reasons for the crisis that we currently face. And if at all, we could say that the fact that we are experience the current crisis is not a surprise. If we connect the dots, then perhaps we should have assumed that we would end up at this point, at some point in our history. Many term it as an economic crisis, but I would say that it is a political crisis that led to the economic crisis now. So what do I mean? Many say that, you know, Sri Lanka is called the oldest democracy in Asia, but I would say that democratic values have not really been internalized, because people view their role in this democracy only as casting a vote, whereas the role of citizens, the most important role that they play, is in between elections in holding their elected representatives accountable. And this really has not been the case in our history, because political culture in Sri Lanka is driven by patronage. There are still feudal elements in our society. Loyalty is prized. And the political culture functions according to these values. So politicians are viewed as demigods, and you do not hold them to account. You do not ask how public funds are being spent. And this has been the political culture which we have seen for a long time, at least for several decades in Sri Lanka. We've also had, and I think some of the other speakers will go into speak of this in more detail, is we still have a powerful executive with very few checks and balances. Our public institutions are politicized. So if we take the police, for instance, a very politicized institutions. This means that when people experience human rights violations, they have very few remedies, or it is cumbersome to access the remedies, or even when they do access the remedies, they will not obtain a result for probably years on end, because even if you file a fundamental rights petition in the Supreme Court, it can take 5, 10, even 10 years or even longer. Impunity is entrenched. For example, police brutality is systemic and it is normalized. It was also something that did not create social outrage, because when we were at the commission, and Dr. Udagama will also remember this, is we submitted a report to the UN Committee Against Torture. I think that's the very first time the Sri Lankan Human Rights Commission has done so. And we said that torture was systemic. There was outrage. The president at the time was angry with us. We had editorials in Sinhala newspapers. The police were very displeased with us. Whereas this change that we have seen post-COVID in particular, and also during the protests since early this year, is that the public too is beginning to understand that the police it's a very dysfunctional, violent, abusive institution that functions with impunity, and the public are also demanding accountability. Then, of course, a factor which I think when we speak about the protests, the economic crisis, the political crisis, one of the elements that does not come through, but I think that runs through all this and has controlled political decision-making in this country is, of course, the ethnic conflict. And that, in a way, lies also at one of the cause, I would say, of this problem, because it is during the 2 decades of the war that impunity became entrenched. And the war ended with grave violations of human rights and humanitarian law, which to date remain unaddressed. And the fact that people in positions of power were allowed to get away with such grave violations, even when, for instance, there's video evidence in the form of the Channel 4 documentary, for instance, that I think emboldened particularly the Rajapaksas, because it was the Rajapaksas who I would say created this crisis that we are in currently, and they are the ones who are also in power for a good 10 years. And it was during their period that we saw the corruption escalated. We saw public institutions were increasingly politicized, and also the they ended the war brutally, for which they have not been held accountable. So Aswini, in your introduction, you said that some are calling Sri Lanka a police state now. But I would say that for some groups or some communities, it has been a police state for a long time. And of course, we've seen few periods of relatively democratic and progressive governments, like for instance, 2015 to 2020. But even during these periods, impunity was not addressed in meaningful ways. And we also saw that institutions such as the police function pretty much the same way. So during our period at the commission, we did see, the change in the statistics of the complaints about police torture that we received. They might reduce by 50 cases, 60 cases. I think we saw maybe 100, but not considerably, which illustrated that the problem was systemic and it was structural. And another element that cannot be ignored, because particularly if you're speaking about the current crisis and the Rajapaksas and what enabled them to push the country to the brink of disaster, or actually to disaster, is Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. Because historically too, many political decisions have been driven by Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. It's also bolstered by the constitution, which gives a special place to Buddhism. So we cannot really call our constitution a secular constitution in that context. But this is what enabled the Rajapaksas to come to power, to remain in power, and even when they were ousted, to return to power so quickly, is they use this as a tool. And they use this to demonize particular communities. And during the last elections, of course, it was after the Easter attack. So the Muslims community was demonized, and they were made, they were portrayed as security threats, which only the Rajapaksas could then counter, because they are the war heroes who won the war against the LTT, against whom no other government, could destroy the LTTE. So Sinhala Buddhist nationalism has driven this, and particularly the former president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. What I say is that his policy, or his ethos, his values are based on two pillars, and Sinhala Buddhist nationalism as well as militarization. Now, militarization is something that we have seen accelerate after the end of the war, ironically enough, and it was most visible in the north and the east. What do I mean by this? A large number of large military camps, acres, hundreds of acres, these were built on military camps in the north and the east. Military engaged in, and even now engages in, surveillance and intimidation, particularly of civil society, of NGOs, of dissenters, of journalists. Military runs large agricultural farms on hundreds of acres, and this actually undercuts the local farmers, which, as you can imagine, during the economic crisis, it is worse, because the military farms are subsidized by the state, but the local farmers are not. Local farmers have no access to fertilizers, for instance, whereas the military farms do have that. And of course, the military takes over public lands. The impact of it on civil society in the north and the east has also been quite adverse, because they're subject to intimidation, surveillance, all that. Now, the militarization, I think people in the south became aware of it during the Aragalaya that Aswini mentioned, or the protests, when we found that the state started, or the government of the time started employing the military to crack down on the protesters, particularly the brutal assault on protesters during the early hours of 22nd July. Then, of course, what do I mean that, it's part of a continuum, and it is not something new, is that these abusive laws, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which has been used to detain on a detention order, that is administrative detention, under administrative detention, 3 persons who are part of the Inter-University Students' Federation, the PTA has been used for decades. It allows for administrative detention up to 18 months. A confession that you give to a police officer of the rank of the assistant superintendent of police or above is admissible as evidence in a trial. This, of course, leads or creates room for torture. And in many of the cases that have been filed, the main piece of evidence tends to be the confession, which was obtained through torture. Now, of course, and what happened was that after April 2019 and the Easter attacks, it was the Muslims that became the target of this law. Hundreds of Muslims who were arbitrarily arrested and detained under this law. For instance, having a Quran in Arabic, or having some documentation in Arabic, or having a painting of a sword, one person was arrested, things like that. So, and now they're using the same law against the protesters, the ones who participate in the Aragalia. Same, for instance, if you look at the declaration of a state of emergency, because we have a public security ordinance, which gives excessive powers to the presidents without adequate checks and balances. And the ordinance is also not in line with international standards and principles. This was used during the war to issue emergency regulations that impacted the media, that impacted the Tamil community, but not always the general population. But the general population, particularly in the South, began to realize the impact of the declaration of the state of emergency, because the government started using it to squash the protests in the South. And of course, now we have the Bureau of Rehabilitation Bill, which is a law that once again militarizes, or it legalizes the involvement of the military in rehabilitation. And who do they want to rehabilitate? Well, there is actually no definition. It is a very broad category. So even one of us could be sent for rehabilitation. And of course, they seem to be targeting particular populations. We can speak about this in more detail later. And of course, it legalizes, as I said, the involvement of military in this. It also legalizes the use of torture or violence during this rehabilitation process. And so finally, what is different about the current protests and what is not different? What is different, I would say, is that citizens came out in numbers. Usually it is protests that are organized by political parties or trade unions, but here we actually saw citizens. But of course, we did not see as many people from the North and the East participating in it. The question is why? But the question is why, and the answer is also that many people, populations in the North and the East have also been protesting for a very long time. The families that disappeared, for instance, have been protesting for more than 2,000 days. There are small protests when the military tries to take over private land in the North and the East. So in a sense, I would say, speaking with people in the North and the East, they felt like they have been protesting for a very long time and they're continuing to protest. And they also felt like, okay, we have done this for a very long time. So now you have to join, you have to take the lead in this protest. That is the people in the South. And of course, we saw more people in the urban areas participating in the protest than the rural areas. So the question is why? I think that goes back to also my earlier point about our political culture and the culture of patronage, and it's still being feudal, and the Rajapaksa is probably still having quite a bit of support in the South. So the question for us is to tackle all this. And I think, Aswini, we'll probably discuss this later on, is how do we tackle this? Because this is not new. There is a historical perspective to this. It is systemic, it is structural. Going forward, what is it that we need to do to address this? And particularly in terms of civic action, civil society and the public, the citizen, what is it that they need to do? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ambika. That really sets out well the evolution of the current protests and the potential, I'm going to say, for change that comes through them, but lots of questions remain, which we can discuss. So and with that, I'm going to turn now to Dr. Deepika Udagama. Welcome, Deepika. And so I'm going to turn over to you in that case.
Well, thank you, Aswini, and thank you to the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales for putting together this session and for inviting me and giving us an opportunity to focus on what's going on in Sri Lanka, which is extremely problematic. And I mean, it's true. This is what has happened at the moment in the past few months in terms of unprecedented economic crisis, which has turned Sri Lanka into an insolvent. We are not in a position to pay our debts, etc. Mounting violations of civil and political rights, but this is nothing new. We've seen spirals of this for decades now. And indeed, the violation of economic and social rights in a very, very strong way, which I think my friend Upul will address, because he has filed a case in the Supreme Court about this. So I think while this crisis is just so serious and it has engulfed the whole country, there are also possibilities, I think, if we really address these current issues in a insightful way. We've got to look at what needs to be done, as was said earlier, about how to deal with this. Because, as was pointed out, what is happening today is very symptomatic of decades of malgovernance, which has been brought about by a particular political culture. It's a very good question as to whether the structural problems created this political culture, or whether the political culture that is not particularly democratic created these structural deficiencies in terms of democracy. So we need to address those long-term issues. But of course, there are issues that have come to light at the moment. I mean, there is a great degree of focus on abolishing the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which has, I think the UN Human Rights Council has been pointing to, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. I mean, not to mention, of course, for decades now, local activists have, been pointing to. So how do we deal with this? We have then a very interesting history filled with paradoxes. Since 1931, we have been voting. We got universal adult franchise on a platter while we were still a colony, a British colony. And then since independence, we've been governed under constitutions. So there's been constitutional rule. But the point, I think, what we see today is a crisis in constitutionalism. We've had constitutions. We have invested very heavily in constitutional reform. We've seen under each government so many constitutional amendments. But the problem, I think, is this crisis in constitutionalism about inadequate checks and balances, inadequate separation of powers, and so on. And then, of course, since I think Sri Lanka became a republic, ironically, I think all of this started under the 1972 Republican Constitution. The state became very authoritarian. I mean, structurally, it is very authoritarian. And then, of course, with the insurrection in 1971 in the South, you see the declaration of a state of emergency, which lasted nearly 40 years. It ended in 2011 with very short periods, as was pointed out, of normalcy and government under normal laws. We've been governed under laws of exception, and it has become a habit. This is what you see today too. Although there is no permanent state of emergency, this current government also has attempted to govern through emergency, and then laws of exception like the Prevention of Terrorism Act. They've become a habit because of that long period of governance under emergency. So we really have a system of government or governance, which is very national security oriented. Now, if you look at the current situation, people did not create this economic crisis in any way. People were ready to pay taxes. In fact, during the last government, I think middle class in particular was taxed very heavily. People paid their taxes, but then suddenly we were told you don't need to pay the taxes. So, I mean, you pointed to all these, really bad policies which resulted in the current economic crisis. Now what you have is a situation of impoverishment. The middle class becoming poor and the low income groups becoming absolutely impoverished. And then when you protest against it, you're told that, well, I mean, the current president has said that it's fascism, and that also it's terrorism. So you see this, the resurgence, the revival of the national security state to respond to that. And that's, of course, not going to resolve it. So I think while we look at these immediate reforms that are required, for certain, the abolition of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and having a constitutional amendment that will ensure the establishment of, at least to some extent, some degree of independent institutions, we've got to think of the long term. That's very important. So for the moment, I'm sure the Bar Council is thinking of, practical steps that you could take to support the struggle for democracy in Sri Lanka. I think it's very important to emphasize the role of the protesters. That's the only hope this country has, to be honest. Because if there were such social movements in the past decades, I think Sri Lanka would have been quite a different place. But there was this, I think for various reasons, we've hardly seen strong social movements in the past. So freedom of association and freedom of assembly and freedom of expression are of the essence for everything, to secure our economic and social rights and everything. So I think at the moment we've got to focus on those. But in the long run, I think we've got to think in terms of a sea change in, the political establishment and in structures. That's absolutely of the essence. This is what the protest movement, the youth very intelligently called system change. They had no intention of taking over power, as some, there is this, false narrative that is being created on the part of the government, that these are a group of fascists and terrorists who were, bent on capturing power. I don't think that was the intention at all. This was a people's movement that wished to, launch a strong protest about governance. The embedded forms of malgovernance, corruption, and so on. So I think we've got to find ways of, giving expression to that in a structural way. So we need a new constitution, that is for sure. But before that, we do need elections. So currently we have this strange, as you very rightly pointed out, Aswini, a sort of a very hybrid form of government, which is, well, it does appear, though it's not very hybrid, a president who was who hardly had the electoral base. I mean, he was defeated at the last polls. He couldn't enter parliament, but it is through a technicality he's entered parliament. He occupies the only seat of his party. And he, of course, was known to have liberal credentials. He was the prime minister of the former good governance government, which we saw. We were on the Human Rights Commission at that time. Actually, there were improvements in human rights. I think everybody noted that. But currently what has happened is this president with liberal credentials has joined forces with extremely discredited, nepotistic sort of political formation, the Rajapaksa, establishment, so to speak. I mean, it is an establishment, to launch this sort of attacks against protesters, and and there's a sort of that strong belief on their part, by cracking down on this protest, their problems will go away and they will be able to preserve their way of governance. But this is exactly what the youth are saying that ought to change, the form of governance. So immediately, I think we need to have elections. Elections can be held next year in March under the current constitutional framework. But the president seems to be saying he's not ready for that. He's not interested in elections. Elections will be held when they're due. So even the short-term reforms that we are calling for seem to be very difficult, simply because we have a president who doesn't have legitimacy. He may have been elected by parliament under constitutional provisions, but he doesn't have legitimacy. Then we have a parliament that is absolutely discredited and lacks legitimacy. And the majority in parliament is this discredited political, formation or political segment that is headed by the Rajapakshas. So we need to forge a new social contract, even in the long, to achieve these short-term reforms. But in the long run, civil society has to be strengthened. So we need, there is the positive thing in this entire, really sad episode for this country, which has so much of potential, is that there is an awakening, a civic awakening, and that is the most important. So we need to harness that. So we need everybody's assistance for that. But the point is, how this is to be sustained is really an issue. So for the elections and also for future purposes, for, let's say, for example, drafting of a new constitution, a lot needs to be done. So at the moment, I would say, I don't know, even when speaking, discussing this situation, it's very difficult to speak in a logical manner because it's so complex. And you just wonder where one would begin, because there are so many threads that have to be pulled together. But the only hope, as I said, is this protest movement, which is being suppressed. So let's talk about this in the question and answer session. And I also want to say one thing, that in the long run, whatever structural sort of changes that we bring in, long-term structural changes, we've got to focus a lot on institutions, because over the decades, since I would say the 1972 Constitution, we've seen a serious erosion of democratic institutions. There have been so many inroads made into judicial independence. There are serious questions about the role of the Attorney General's Department. As a Bar Council, I'm sure you're very interested in that. The Bar Association from time to time has been very active, and we have seen that another active period, a very active period during these protests. Actually, Bar Association is considered to be such a pillar of strength to this the protest movement. Previously, also when the then Chief Justice was impeached, the Bar Association played a very important role. So we've seen periods of great activism on the part of the bar. But then coming back to institutional issues, in terms of having an election in the near future, we have election commission that is, with political appointees. The Human Rights Commission has been functioning quite well, but I think there are also, the question is being asked about the mode of appointment. So any long-term reform should focus a lot on institutional integrity. And this is this is the main reason why we can't really deal with corruption. Corruption has paved the way for all these transgressions in the economic field, and which also I would say have resulted in economic and resulted in also civil and political rights violations. So I think the international community, and certainly, those of us in Sri Lanka, we've got to put our heads together to think of what needs to be done in the short term and what needs to be done in the long term. Because if we focus only on the short term, I think that's a mistake, because there needs to be a sea change in the the way in which the country is governed, and to get rid of this, for example, the national security mentality, the majoritarian mentality. It's going to take a long period of time. And then even in terms of, constitutional governance, to emphasize constitutionalism. And I think what the youth are really asking for is, yes, we can have constitutions and constitutional reform, but we need constitutionalism. We want those principles entrenched, and we want those principles really respected. So let me end there.
Jump in. Yes, thank you so much.
Let me end there. Maybe it was just, sort of rambling, but these are thoughts that occur to one as one tries to think of what needs to be done in the for future purposes. I think our analysis about why this came about is quite clear. It's a question of malgovernance, and it's a crisis of constitutionalism. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I think that what's interesting is the twists and turns in the fortunes of Sri Lanka, the struggle for democracy now that you outline, and the constitutional issues which are entrenched and need proper scrutiny. Probably there are questions already about the role of the international community in trying to do that. But I think we also need to look at what's happening on the ground and how our domestic court system and lawyers are functioning, and putting pressure on the government, and what hope there is for using that, as well as assisting the protesters. I know the Bar Association and lawyers in Sri Lanka have been extremely active and putting themselves on the line in the most courageous of ways. And one of those lawyers is Upul Jayasuriya. So Upul, I'm going to ask you now and turn to you to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much. You need to unmute yourself, Upul.
Thank you, Ashwini. Thanks for the invitation. I'll get on to the topic straight away. And talking about the system change that the protesters were asking. Now, who brought this topic of system change first? The system change was brought in first by Gotabaya Rajapaksa when he went for the people at the presidential election in 2019. He promised a system change, but the little system that we had, that some democratic governance that was introduced by the 19th Amendment was done away. That's the change that he made, delivered to the people of this country. In the meantime, having come to power, just before he came to power, he promised the people that he will bring in some unitary tax system that will relieve mostly the direct taxes and then go for the indirect taxes. And finally, he introduced this, that was there in the election manifesto, the Vistasa Splendor. And then one of the first cabinet meetings, at the 28th of December 2019, he brought in a recommendation to do away with 10 taxes, including withholding tax, the GST, the BTT, and the corporate taxes, individual taxes. And this tax concession that he gave to the people is not something that was asked for by the people. These taxes, the relief rebates were given, not the rebates, rather the tax relief was given to the community. And nobody said, don't give it also, because that was our business community. And as a result of that, the country lost 681 billion, a staggering amount. Now, from there, that's where the problem started. Then he took another decision to stop the fertilizer. With that, the entire agriculture economy went down the precipice. Then in the meantime, the construction industry that had to be paid something like 150 billion has not been paid. There are about more than 1 million people who are involved, who are employed in the construction industry. All of them are today unemployed because the construction material has gone up, and the bills that are to be paid by the government, mostly these road projects and so on and so forth, all are now come to a grinding halt. But the 150 billion that should have been paid or could have been paid by the government has not been paid. And that could have been easily paid if they did not do give the tax relief. Now, having done that, then they came to a situation, the Minister of Finance at that time, the first Minister of Finance was appointed in the Rajapaksa regime, Gotabaya's regime, was the Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, his own brother. Now, Mahinda Rajapaksa himself did not have any competence to handle the economy. And it was well known. It was not something that was not known that we were going to face a huge economic issue, because most of the sovereign debts were maturing during that period of time. And he was brought in. And what did he do? He was informed time and again by the central bank by virtue of reports that were required to be sent under Section 64 and 68 of the Monetary Law. And he was told time and again that the the reserves were depleting, and we will not have sufficient reserves to pay the debts, but we kept on spending the reserves for the payment of the import bills, and irrespective of the fact that our reserve, it was a burden on our reserves. Then what happened was, the Monetary Board also took a decision to curtail the imports, because even for the imports, we could not have gone ahead at the normal rate as we did before. You take, for instance, 21 December, year on year, we had $2.3 billion worth of imports. That was a much higher figure than the previous year. So we could not have afforded that. So, but we went along with it, because P.B. Jayasundara, the Secretary to the President, instructed the central bank by letter, that was in June 2020, that we are not going to change the dollar. The dollar should be pegged and it should be kept at 203. And that the central bank, what happened was the governor and the Monetary Board, they had no legal obligation to listen to the instructions given by the Treasury, the Secretary to the President, but he went along with the recommendation and he implemented that. As a result of which, we had to divert large amount of reserves to fund the imports. Then we knew very well at a certain point that our reserves were not going to be sufficient to meet the debt payments, to pay for the maturing sovereign bills, international sovereign bills, and also to meet other local expenses. And they realized that this was going to be bringing pressure on the banking sector. Knowing very well, they were writing letters under Section 64 and 68 to the Minister of Finance. Then firstly to the Minister of Finance, Mahinda Rajapaksa. Then he was replaced by his other brother, Basil Rajapaksa. They were writing letters. Regularly they were writing letters. But all these letters or the communications went over their heads. Nothing was responded. Now, whilst this was happening, P.B. Jayasundara also, the Monetary Board took another decision to go, in order to curtail the imports. They took a decision to require, as required under Section 103 of the Monetary Law, 150% on all letters of credit, so that there should be deposits on the margin up to 150%, so that the importers will be discouraged. That again was interfered by the Minister of, the P.B. Jayasundara, Secretary to the President. That was a violation of the monetary law. Now, these things were taken into consideration by the Supreme Court in the matter that has been filed by three learned men, Professor Dr. Mahim Mendis and Dr. Davis Morales and Dr. Atulasiri Samarkot. And they have given some far-reaching orders in this. In fact, at a certain stage, the Monetary Board members were invited by the Cook Committee headed by Dr. Chanta Hera. They were asked what happened during your time, because in that Monetary Board, there were only two members who were present in the previous board as well. That they were Mr. Sanjeeva Jayawardena, who was a lawyer by profession, and Dr. Rani Jayamaha. Then they explained that they have, as far as they are concerned, they have on time and again, on 9 occasions, they have written to the Monetary Board not to peg the dollar, as it was going to cause huge impact on the dollar reserve that we were having, and also to curtail the imports and various other steps that should be taken. And they have been not acted upon, and the other members, Dr. Lashman and the other members who were on the Monetary Board, they were powered, the two of them, there were 3 others on the board. And we requested these letters to be tabled in the Supreme Court, but the Monetary Board refrained from doing so. But now we have a situation that the Supreme Court has made an order to the Monetary Board to table all these letters to understand what happened. Now, this is very important at this moment of time, to pause for a moment, because we have to get to the root of this issue as to why it went wrong and who managed it, what are the wrong decisions that were taken from time to time. If we don't do that, if we don't take steps as recommended in the UN resolution that have been tabled recently, that those who are responsible for the economic crime should be dealt with. Now, in this application, we have also done something more. We have also made a complaint to the Bribery and Corruption Commission that they have committed an act of corruption under Section 70 of the corruption law, because they have caused loss to the bank and to the people and the economy of this country. As far as the cost of living is concerned, it has now risen. There is no medicine in the hospitals. So, and the children are starving. So they're huge problem. So if we don't attend to these issues as to who is responsible, and then if we don't put it right, then I don't think the international lending agencies will look at us kindly. I must also add to another area with regard to the rule of law situation. At least as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, we have a lot of hope, and we are very content with the manner in which they have dealt with at the initial stage of granting leave, and also the interim order that have been given. But in the meantime, talking about the law, rule of law, if we go back, we turn back to what happened soon after this regime came to power in 2019. What did they do? 700 police officers, their passports were impounded. 700 police officers who were working in the CID and the other related agencies. Now, that has imposed a deterrent on the others who are now tasked with the investigations. So they will not be investigating because they have been told not to do so. If you do that, this is the kind of fate that you are going to face. So that is a situation. Now take, for instance, Mr. Shani Abeysekar is one of those top officers that we had, 100% honest, immaculately honest. Now he has been ordered to be given security, and this has been recommended by the Witness Protection Authority. He has not been given any security. We had to file cases in the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeal and then seek security fine. So this is going on and on, as the other learned speakers have explained. The government and the governance is much to be desired, and we are going through a situation where racism is still practiced. We can understand how this is going on because Mr. Wickremesinghe, during the 5-year period of 2015 to 2019, he was a different personality. Now he actually, truthfully, did not use the PTA not in a single instance. But soon after he came to power, during this last few weeks, he used it to incarcerate 3 people. They were not armed terrorists. They were people, unarmed people who were protesting on the road. Now they have been taken into custody and then held under the PTA. Now, as Ambika said, the Tamil community did not come forward this time to join the protest. Why didn't they come forward? If they came forward, the Muslim community came forward, they would have been labeled as terrorists. Not that they had no sympathy for the struggle that was going on, but they were scared during the situation, during the last few, not only during the war, even thereafter. There are so many people who have been taken into custody and they held in incarceration. No charges, they still kept, and sometimes they are held in custody for more than 2 years, sometimes 3 years, and they are released without any charges. Now, of the 3 people who have been taken into custody under the PTA a few days ago, and I'm defending one of them, and he has been discharged after 50 days of detention without any charge. But I'm still going ahead with the FR application. So this is the kind of situation. So I'm recommending, I think this was also recommended by Mr. Jeffrey Robertson, that there should be some mechanism to deal with those people who are taking these decisions. They should be denied visas to any country. If ever they think of visiting any other foreign country, they should be denied visa. There must be a mechanism that should be forwarded. We invite the British Law Society and the other related agencies, maybe the IBA, to make these recommendations to the UN and the other institutions to deny these people visas when they seek to travel to other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Upal. That's a lot of territory covered there. And I just picking up on the 700 police officers who had their passports impounded. I think they were investigating past corruptions and crimes during the war and economic crimes, and they were stopped from doing so. And that has prevented other officers from taking up that position. It's another example of the, the suppression of investigation of past crimes and so on, which it seems to be endemic at the moment. Also the role of the Supreme Court seems to be incredibly important, and I'm interested, and I think others will be interested too, in understanding in due course, there's obviously a great deal of confidence that has been placed in the Supreme Court to provide some assistance and results and hold accountable the government for what it's doing currently. Before we come to that, we have had a few questions now posed to you, and I have some questions for you as well. And so there are, I think, perhaps not unsurprisingly, the questions are focusing almost immediately on international community and what we can expect from, say, India, China, and some other neighbors, we might call them. India, of course, is a near neighbor, and what we might expect of the international community. So one of the questions is, what is the role of India? Most countries, when in trouble, seek geographical political support. Is that something that's worthwhile? And who is our closest and most influential international ally? Perhaps starting there, I turn to Ambika and Deepika first of all to share their thoughts on that question.
Do you want to go first, Ambika, or shall I? Okay. Well, I think that's a very interesting question. Where the economic crisis is concerned, India has, come forward in a very major way, and India has been extremely supportive. Now, as we know, China played a very major role, during the Rajapaksa regime. That's the pre-2015 period. And things sort of cooled off during the Yapalana government, the government between 2015 and 20, but still, of course, good relations were maintained, I would think. But when it came to the economic crisis, we know that the biggest lender to Sri Lanka at that time, I mean, one of the biggest lenders was China. And we constantly hear of this debt trap issue. So when we got into trouble, it was not China which came in, with the promises of restructuring the debt, etc. It was India. China has been, I think, challenged to restructure the debt and so on. But the issue is this: when it comes to resolving the economic crisis, yes, there can be temporary, assistance, loan, aid, and that sort of thing. But the country requires not only these economic aid packages like the IMF might, we don't know, the discussions are going on. But in the long run, this country is going to survive and revive only if very serious structural changes are made. And I don't think India or China, neither India nor China, will deal with those issues. I doubt very much. On the human rights front, for example, either they'll vote against or abstain. So when it comes to human rights issues and issues of governance, when civil society, in the sense of civic groups, are relying more on the European Union, and the United States, Australia, Canada, and so on and so forth. But they are not the ones who are giving a lot of financial assistance at the time, but some countries are giving almost humanitarian assistance, I would say, to buy drugs and food, and so on and so forth. So this is a moment, I think, actually for international civil society to really play a major role before all fora, recognizing the issues that are involved. First of all, impunity must be dealt with. All those against whom there are allegations of serious violations of human rights must be made to answer. The other is impunity with regard to corruption. corruption is what did this country in among, together with the other issues of malgovernance and so on, but malgovernance and corruption have gone hand in hand, patronage and so on. So those are two issues that the international community can be extremely, strong on. I know the international community, civic organization, international civil society, and then of course, including the UN Human Rights Council have been strong on those issues, but we've really got to push the envelope there, in terms of holding those accountable for human rights violations and corruption. So in terms of international support, that's where we are. I tend to digress. I'm sorry. I mean, we are living in such a difficult time. Your thoughts wander, and you are really, it's not
No
a
problem.
very abnormal situation. It's not out of the ordinary because we're used to it, as was said, for decades, but this situation really caps it. It's sort of the lowest point. So that's where we are, where our international community is concerned. So I think this is the time for democratic voices and democratic, formations, international civil society to really play a very big role.
Okay. So I think in some ways you're saying that change must come from within, but Ambika, before I ask you to address that question, one of the things that pops into my head, of course, is that through the UN processes over the last decade or more, there have been countries voting for and against the resolutions of the UN. And I think the Sri Lankan government takes a particular view in relation to the support that they get from other international, other countries, other than those who vote for the resolutions, and take some comfort even from the fact that it's not a unanimous vote in favor of a resolution. Just bearing that as a sort of small context, perhaps you to just, what are your views on that question?
Firstly about China, I think currently also the debt restructuring, there is an obstacle to that, and that is mainly China, because we need to have China agree before the Paris Club and others, come forward with a package, with the IMF is able to do so. And also Japan apparently is waiting to see what the agreement with China is before convening a conference. And of course, China is dragging its feet, supposedly. Now, this, I think, is also linked very much. What we see is that is one aspect of it. But the other aspect is also, you see a lot of activity, for instance, on social media, particularly by, accounts, even the Chinese embassy accounts, etc., who also enable to propagate, to perpetuate certain narratives. And those narratives we can see are once again pro-Rajapaksa. And they're countering people who are part of the protests, or they're countering these other dissenting voices. So I think that is something we cannot ignore, because there is something brewing once again. So you have the debt restructuring, the formal processes, and then you also have these other processes that are not particularly official, where you can see a support being given to a certain narrative, to a certain group or a political party. In relation to the UN Human Rights Council, of course, the council led by the core group, and those are mainly Western nations. We've also seen an uptick on social media in backlash. For a while, the pro-Rajapaksa accounts, the trolls, etc., were quiet. But what we've seen once again after Ranil Wickremesinghe was elected president is that has also increased. For instance, the US ambassador has been subject to a lot of backlash and racist backlash, and implying, actually openly saying that she and her government are supporting the protesters and they're inciting the protesters, etc. So there is all this going on, which we can see. And also we've also seen people who are part of the regime coming out openly. So I think there is the formal structures where you have the aid, you have countries voting openly, you have the debt restructuring going on, the negotiations there. There's also a lot happening in other spaces which are trying to influence thinking locally for or against certain processes, and not particularly progressive ones, because they are harking back to the racist, to the communal, to the non-democratic, to the patronage-driven politics.
Yes, thank you. It's complex, isn't it? And both you and Deepika keep, demonstrating how there are wheels within wheels in terms of, if you look at the international community, but also civil society and the influences on debates that are taking place within Sri Lanka. We're going to come, I'm sure we'll come back to some more of the sort of mechanisms and so on that we might look to, but I wanted to ask Upul next about those mechanisms within the sort of the domestic sphere, and again looking at sanctions coming from within, bearing in mind the case that he mentioned in the Supreme Court. And really, I think one of the questions certainly that's been on my mind is really, what can the Supreme Court do to bring about real change? As I understand things, to bring about, to sanction and to restrain corruption and impunity, that needs to come from within constitutional and governance changes. What can the Supreme Court on its own do in the current climate?
Well, I don't think, with all due respect to the Supreme Court, that a lot can be done by the Supreme Court, other than in cases when they are brought before them. If it involves like the one that we were discussing a while ago, with regard to the economic crimes that have been committed by the members of the Monetary Board and also the members of the cabinet, which we have complained, and then they have decided to go into it. At the outset, we went on supporting this matter for 12 days, from morning 10 o'clock to 3:30 p.m. for 12 sometimes consecutive and different days. So they are doing their best. But as far as the mechanism is concerned, the issue is left for the Bribery Commission. Now, if I have to tell you the experience that these three academics had to face with regard to the Bribery Commission, they first got a letter from the Bribery Commission saying that they have decided to investigate their complaint. And that's a welcome situation. It's not always that you get a letter like that. But then when they are with all the papers and affidavits and so on to discuss, and then they were asked to come there and then make a formal complaint, they were asked, how do you say that, what is the legal basis of the complaint that you are making? And they were asking legal advice. Some officer was asking legal advice from these gentlemen who are not lawyers. So these are matters. The problem becomes where the powers that are vested with various institutions, include the Attorney General. There have been reservations on from time to time. When they don't exercise the powers in a positive manner, and sometimes now, for instance, there was another issue with regard to the central bank itself. One of my clients, and I find that case, which is now referred to as the Greek bond case. And that was 12 years ago, in 2010. Now, there was also a complaint that was made to the Bribery Commission at that time. People spoke about it at that time. 12 years have passed, nothing has happened so far. So this is a funny kind of a situation. Now, there are so many institutions, complaints that have been made to the CID. Now, will they be making an independent investigation when they know the fate of the officers who have been dealt with, sometimes not only by interdicting them and terminating them from services, they have been remanded, they have been harassed like a common criminal. So in this kind of situation, we must strengthen the democratic institution that we have. So one way that we can do that would be to strengthen the constitutional aspects of it and bring back the good features that we had under the 19th Amendment, particularly the Constitutional Council, the manner in which the members were appointed by different groups, not necessarily by the parliament or a politician. Now at the moment, what they have brought in so far is for the speaker to appoint the people from the civil society. Now that again is a political decision. So that is not going to take us anywhere, whether you're talking about the procurement commission or the bribery commission or the attorney general or such institution or the police chief. And we have to not only justice be done, it should manifestly appear to have been done. So I think we have to get on to the basics and then put them right.
So I think this is the big question, isn't it, in the room? We've heard about the struggle for democracy and the demands for system change. You know, you're talking about institutions where appointments are taking place in the current system. They're not going to change. They're political appointments, and they will be until there is this system change. What are your collective thoughts and individual thoughts about how this system change is actually to be wrought? How are we to produce a constitutional change if we have a government that's not willing to hold elections, and we have a government that is, as I understand it, proposing constitutional amendments which aren't really strong enough to produce independent institutions? So what are, you know, perhaps I could ask one of you to explain really what the government is doing in terms of its constitutional changes. But more importantly, I think the questions are, what is the mechanism to create the system change? So I'm going to ask either, well, let me ask Deepika, and we'll come back to you, Upul. I'm sure you have a lot to say on that question as well.
Well, I mean, this is really the million-dollar question. How do you bring that about? It's extremely difficult because you have this entrenched political establishment, which is the problem. And it is this political establishment, which is in parliament and in the executive branches, which are now steering whatever the reform agenda they think, I mean, what the reform agenda which they think is required by the country. This is the problem. So this is why we need to forge a new social contract, and that is why we need elections. So that has to be the major demand, in my opinion. And the general election, that is to elect new members of parliament, should be accompanied by, in my opinion, a referendum to check the views of the public on the presidency. There's no doubt about it. The executive presidency has not served this country well at all. In fact, it is the major problem. I mean, it's not the only problem, but it is the major problem because there's this concentration of power in one individual who doesn't seem to be accountable to anybody. So that has to be dealt with. But I think what's important is that while dealing with all of that, to keep the voices of the protest movement alive. So this crackdown on the protest movement should be dealt with in a very strong way. And that's where I would like to add to what Upul said. I think the Supreme Court has a very important role to play in, reinforcing faith in the fundamental rights chapter, in the protection provided by the Constitution, even though it doesn't go as far as international human rights obligations of Sri Lanka. Still, there has been in the past very strong judgments in favor of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. So that's very important. Then there, as I said, the fight against impunity when it comes to these emblematic human rights cases, and certainly corruption. So I think there ought to be two things. One is to deal with the current political establishment which has caused all these problems and hold them accountable, make them accountable. That's one. The second is to keep the Aragale or the protest movement and the message of the protest movement alive, to provide that recognition and legitimacy to it. Because in Sri Lanka, what the government is doing is completely delegitimizing it and, really creating a lot of, it's a very oppressive situation for dissent. So that has to be kept alive while we work towards the future. And in terms of working towards the future, working with the civic, I don't want to say civil society because it gives a wrong impression of only the established non-governmental organizations, but to work with, civic groups, citizen groups that, especially the youth, to give them strength and a voice to for them to participate in the political process themselves. Because the question is being asked, okay, we can have elections next year, but we might get more of the same. So that's a possibility. But I think that's where we need to really put our heads together to ensure that there are new, either faces, the established political parties which are in the opposition, also bring in new faces, dynamic, youth into this, and also provide assistance to create new political formations, new political parties, alliances, and so on. And it will ideally be, I think it would be ideal to also work on a blueprint for a new constitution. I think that's very important. And this has to be, of course, a people's initiative. We are always, tweaking the existing constitution and we think it is going to work. It's not going to work. So I think working on that also will be very important. The other is, of course, to challenge the institutions that are not doing their job, that are compromised, as Upul pointed out. So dealing with these corruption cases, and there was also a question where one of the colleagues who's participating had asked, there are, there's economic assistance given by various countries, and shouldn't they be conditional? And I think, yes, economic assistance must be given. And that is where I think European Union and all the countries that care for democracy and to ensure that, these government, there's issues of governance, malgovernance are dealt with, should make those conditional on human rights protection and, good governance. That's absolutely essential. So I think a whole array of actions are required, some short term, but always keeping the long-term reforms, the system change that that's been referred to often, which is the main demand of the youth protesters, and all of us, I would say, in mind, because it is not possible to change anything in a stopgap manner. It's not. Can't do tweaking. It won't result in anything, of value. And this political, establishment has to go. There are politicians who have been in government for decades, changing sides. They are in almost every government. But what have they done? Eventually, they brought the country to its knees, depriving people of their civil and political rights and also economic and social rights. So if they keep on contesting and if they keep on winning, that's not going to change anything. So I think, I'm not saying that, the Bar Council or any international, any government or any international, civil society activism or action on Sri Lanka can ensure that, because that's up to the citizens of Sri Lanka. But that strengthening must be there, highlighting all the ills ought to be there. So while assisting Sri Lanka economically, there has to be a strong sense. Your governance is very problematic. You are the problem. We are assisting the people of the country. And we simply think there has to be a radical change in the way in which governance is done. So, I think that sort of a message has to come forward. That's very important.
Thank you. I think, what you say, there's obviously a sea change is what we're looking at, and also bringing in new politicians and new ways of thinking. It's a cultural change as well, and looking to the young people who are active and protesting. I guess that's where we're looking to, isn't it? And I've seen, certainly on the things that I've watched, some very impressive young people who perhaps we should be looking to more than the fusty old fuddy-duddies who keep turning up and ruining the country. But look, turning to you, Ambika, on this, I know your hand is up as well. It's just that looking at conditionalities, if you could just think of this as well as you're addressing us, I know that the IMF, lots of people are looking to the IMF and hoping that despite their September staff report, that there's going to be some more firm recommendations and conditionalities required by them. And I understand that they've been firmer with other countries, I believe in Haiti and places like that, where they've put forward some very firm requirements on democratic and constitutional changes, which may have the potential for faster impact, I'm going to say, thinking about protests and things like that. I wonder whether you have any views on that, in addition to whatever your response now, Ambika.
I was about to say about the conditionality, because right now what we have next week is we have the mission from the European Union will be visiting Sri Lanka, because they're meeting with the Sri Lankan government related to the renewal of the GSP plus trade privileges is going to take place in December. So the GSP trade privileges are conditional on the fulfillment of human rights requirements. That is the UN covenants to implement the UN conventions to which Sri Lanka has, is a party and has ratified. So the struggle there, though, is I don't think there is anyone now who would say, do not give GSP plus, because the country is in dire economic straits. And the people who are going to be most affected if you withdraw GSP plus are for the people working in the free trade zone who had, they've received a beating during COVID and then during the economic crisis, and the majority of these people are women. So there is that struggle, and I think that is something that the government is also exploiting and using, because they do know it would appear really inhumane and barbaric to say people are struggling, they're starving, there's malnutrition, and do not give these benefits, do not give aid. So that in a way, it's a sort of a catch-22 position. And in relation to the IMF, of course, although they can't impose specific conditionalities related to human rights, governance is very important to them, because that is about whether economic reforms can be implemented. Laws and processes relate to corruption are very important to the IMF. And also, if you're looking at the budget, they have said that Sri Lanka's spending in relation to health and education is low. So that is something that we do not need to cut, and we can increase. We do need to have social protection mechanisms for the vulnerable. And most importantly, the military budget, we need to cut that. But what have they done? Today, front page of the newspapers is the appropriation bill for 2023. They've increased the military budget from 370 billion to 410 billion. So if you're looking at cuts, why don't we start there? Because, for instance, the Auditor General has released reports every year now. If you just look at even the last 3 years, the military, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, millions of rupees of mismanagement, wastage, and also possible corruption. So when we say cut the military budget, immediately there is fear mongering saying, there are hundreds of thousands who are employed in the military, and if you let them go now, it'll cause a crisis, particularly in the rural areas, and push people into poverty. But we don't need to actually start demobilizing, them right now. But what we can do right now is a huge amount that can be cut. You do not need to also increase the military budget. So there are many ways to cut the military budget without pushing people to starvation or pushing families in rural areas to starvation.
I think what you're saying has just echoed one of the comments in the chat as well about the use of the military budget and the excessive nature of that. Upul, you were about to say something.
I want to say something about the EU, the sanctions that we are hoping. We are not hoping for them to impose any sanctions, but in the meantime, the GSP is a matter of concern. And as Ambika said, that there is a team from the EU that's going to visit.
Can you just say what the GSP is, please?
Generalize some protection. Huh? Yeah. So anyway, that's the effect of the GSP is that when we are exporting to a certain country, the duty, if it is 15% for for those countries that have the GSP plus benefit, they will be able to export into that country at a reduced taxation, so that our prices become more attractive to that country. So if you don't get this facility of the GSP of usually it's about 15%, then our products become non-competitive. So they will not be able, we'll be losing that market. But one of the main criteria of the GSP is that there are some core conventions that we have to adhere to. Amongst them are the freedom of association and freedom of expression, which is the very thing that are now in question in this country. Whether we like it or not, the freedom of expression is being curtailed to a great extent. People are not able to walk on the road. They unknown people, they can be shouting slogans, but that's their right. They can do that in any country and walk on the road. That is being curtailed. And it happened yesterday, it happened many days in the last few weeks. So freedom of expression, for some little comment that one puts on his Facebook, he's been taken into custody and then produced in court and then remanded for so many days. So they definitely, they know freedom of expression and freedom of association. So I do not know if the EU, we all want the concession to remain for us to be able to be competitive and then bring some the dollars, whatever that we are entitled to be brought in with regard to our exports. But in the meantime, if I hope and pray that the EU will ignore the freedom of the curtailment of freedom of expression and the curtailment of freedom of association in taking this decision to keep us going with the GSP plus tariff.
Well, I can see in the chat, it says it's a generalized system of preferences that the US and EU use to promote good governance in developing countries. You know, so many questions pop into my head from what you've just said, Upul. One is, I mean, there's clearly a tension between moving forward with international, you know, pressure, but also addressing severe violations at the same time, because you move forward in a context of entrenched human rights violations that Ambika spoke of at the very beginning. But because we're coming to the end of our session, I wonder whether I could just try and address a question that's in the chat on the fairness of any elections that might be held next year. Now, one of the other things that BHRC has raised certainly is that the idea of having UN monitored elections, or at least outside monitored elections, because of course there's a real risk that any elections that are held will not be full and fair. And whether you have any ideas around how to ensure fair elections. I'm going to ask Upul actually first, because I hope I didn't cut you off earlier.
Yeah, I think in ensuring a fair election, firstly, the election commission that have been now appointed, it has not been appointed by a constitutional council on an independent basis. So these are handpicked people who have been now appointed to this commission by the Rajapaksas. So we cannot expect them to be doing what they should be doing in holding a fair and free election. So, but in the meantime, therefore, definitely there is no question that we need international monitoring. But even if the international monitoring is there, even if they give an adverse report, if the results are, or if the conduct of the election is not in an independent manner, then we have missed the bus. So the biggest problem at this moment of time that the president is also pressured by the members of parliament is they know that they have no chance at all in winning or coming back to power. That's why they want the election date to be prolonged as long as possible. But the one saving grace would be if they hold the local government elections by next year, which they cannot postpone beyond March by law, they have to hold it. But that's what they are now trying to fly a kite and see where the wind is blowing, saying that they want to change the election process of the local government and so on. I think they're trying to take cover under that situation and then prolong the elections. So I think what they should be doing is not change the law, but we can change the law later on. But as far as the due election, the elections are due by March this year, and they have been postponed by 1 more year. So now that it is postponed, it must be a non-due date. So when that happens, I think the writing will be then on the wall. So And that again will be something that will be more than monitored, will be observed by all the political parties in an active manner at a rural base. So they will not be able to do that kind of election maneuvering at the local government election.
Thank you. Now we are a few minutes over time, and I know I haven't let everyone speak on this particular issue, but I'm going to invite now Deepika, if you want to say something on the elections, please do. But I'm also going to invite you each to just to say, you know, what your concluding thoughts are before we wrap up for today. There's been a lot to think about, I know, so maybe that's a bit of a big ask, but let's see how we get on with that. Deepika, are you still there? And would you wish to say anything more at this point? I think she might have gone. Ambika, let's come to you first in that case.
Oh, yes. I mean, what we have seen is that the protests have enabled, or we've seen people becoming more aware of their civic duties in terms of holding the elected representatives accountable, and that shows that democratic principles are being internalized. And I think that is one of the most positive things about the protest movement. But also, when we speak of reform, I think what we always do is we look for legal solutions to what are social problems. We say draft a new law, set up an institution, but we do not do anything to tackle the very dysfunctional socio-political cultures, and also these informal structures. Sometimes these informal processes and rules take precedence over law. So I think that is something we do need to be aware of and tackle, but much of this change is also long-term. So we need to think about our education system, for instance. Civil society needs to be more active and work in the rural areas to mobilize and create awareness, because right now everyone rushes to the north and the east, but no one really is going to the south and changing mindsets. And of course, finally, I'd just like to address a comment on the comment box saying that I said no need to demobilize, and the person is telling me to wake up. And I've actually been one of the most vociferous critics of the militarization and demilitarizing and demobilization. But of course, the fact is right now, if you have 200,000 persons and you cannot send them off on retirement, you would have to give them a golden handshake and demobilize them. The question of how you deal with that economically, socially, all those questions have to be dealt with, and they can't be dealt with overnight. But what can be dealt with overnight is the financial mismanagement by the military, is the excessive, the wastage, etc. And of course, not increasing the military budget, closing down those farms or handing over the farms to the department, the Ministry of Agriculture, etc.
Thank you. Thank you. So Deepika, I'm just asking for final comments now, but I just see that in the text, the person who had made the comment about, I'm not sure whether he's saying it's about a legalistic approach, and whether that's a comment to you, or whether he's saying the comment about militarization was actually addressed to you, Deepika, but perhaps you could take that into account.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I'm confused myself, because he says he addressed it to me, but I don't think I addressed the issue of
no, I don't think so either.
Mobilization, not at all. But definitely it is something that has to be prioritized. If we are to create this system change and to have a meaningful democracy in this country, we have to deal with this, the manner in which the military has been functioning and is being used by the political establishment for political purposes. I mean, what we call militarization. It has to be dealt with, and the military's role must be really streamlined. I mean, streamlined in the sense it should be confined to its conventional role. That's absolutely important. Now you find military personnel occupying very important governmental positions, diplomatic positions, taking decisions about the economy, etc., etc. So all those things have to be dealt with. I think the North and East has been dealing with militarization for decades now, but we really started to feel that impact in the South with the onset of the Gotabaya government. So that has to be done, and I completely agree with the budget. This is why perhaps we have to now start human rights audits of budgets. That's absolutely important. But there's also a comment here about, dealing with minority rights. I mean, absolutely. And also the fact that, people's movement is the answer. No two words about it. In fact, as I said at the very beginning, the redemption at the moment and any hope for a just and democratic Sri Lanka is the people's movement.